Continuing our journey into the excavation of the allegorical birth of Jesus, we now look at the Joseph of Jesus, the role of King Herod Agrippa I in fathering himself. And yes, Herod Agrippa I fathered himself. Quote unquote, fathered. We will see. The one thing that we failed to do in 2024 is we failed to look back at how the construction of the times were in regards to kings, and not just any kind of kings, as we're going to see, Hellenistic rulers. There is a culture of kingship that goes on from Egypt into Rome. And of course, the children of the Herodian dynasty brought up in Rome and carrying that same intellectual culture into their regions, we really can't take, we can't neglect, we can't take in vain the age and the culture. What we're going to do in this presentation, we're going to look at the age and the culture. The author of Mark is about Marcus. That's why it's called the Book of Mark. It's about Marcus. Marcus has received a new name called Jesus. We saw that in the previous presentation. What we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to look at the culture of surnames given to kings, Hellenistic rulers that have passed on their culture to the Roman imperial cults. The individuals brought up near and within the Roman imperial cults, Herod Agrippa I being one of them, they continue this legacy. We're going to see this. Our journey into the allegorical birth of Jesus is going to get more than interesting. We are familiar with one laying a prophet in their own new tomb, right? We're familiar with this story. Mark 15:45 and 46. And when he knew it of the centurion, he gave the body to Joseph. He bought fine linen, took him down, wrapped him in the linen, laid him in a sepulchre which was hewn out of a rock, rolled a stone unto the door of the sepulchre. We are familiar with this, right? Matthew 27:59, 60. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. He rolled the great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. What I want to just bring up is a question of where does this come from? Is this an original thought from the author, is what I'm getting at. Is this an original thought? Did this actually happen to the character that we're reading about? Did it actually happen? This scene is taken from 1 Kings 13:25-30. And behold, men passed by, saw the carcass cast in the way, the lion standing by the carcass. They came and told it in the city where the old prophet dwelt. When the prophet that brought him back from the way heard thereof, he said, It is the man of God, who was disobedient unto the word of the Lord. Therefore the Lord hath delivered him unto the lion, which hath torn him and slain him, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake unto him. And he spake to his sons, saying, Saddle me the ass. And they saddled him. And he went and found his carcass in the way, and the ass and the lion standing by the carcass. The lion had not eaten the carcass, nor torn the ass. And the prophet took up the carcass of the man of God and laid it upon the ass and brought it back. What did he do? The old prophet came to the city to mourn and to bury him, and he laid his carcass in his own grave. And they mourned over him, saying, Alas, my brother. The scene of one placing the prophet into their own tomb, grave, sepulcher is an invented scene. It never happened. It never happened because the scene is taken from 1 Kings 13:25-30. In this scene, what we have here is a prophet of God that came to utter a judgment against the church that was created by the king. This old prophet supported the church that was created by the king. He was supposed to utter his judgment Don't take anything from that old prophet or from anything around the area. Don't even go back the way you came. Go back another way. He was supposed to have nothing to do with anything here except deliver the message of condemnation. Well, he didn't follow those instructions. He did everything he wasn't supposed to do. And his deity ended up killing him for disobeying the charge that was given to him. This old prophet heard about it, realized that that was actually a prophet from the deity, and that he himself, he knew he was not a real prophet, but he understood that this guy was it. When he saw that the instruction he told him that he should not do, he was killed because he did the opposite of what he should not do. And so he took, realizing that this was a real prophet, he heard about his death, went back, got the body, dressed the body, placed the body in his own tomb, and told his servants, when I die, put me in the tomb with him. That's a real one. Put me in the tomb with him. This story from 1 Kings 13, sectioned out as I have, 25 to 30, it is plagiarized in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John story comes from here. We have to know that. We have to know that. But there's more to this. Because the behavior, right? The behavior of that Joseph towards the main character comes from somewhere. The idea of Joseph placing the prophet into his own tomb comes from the record of the old prophet placing the prophet into his own tomb. As no bone of the prophet was broken by the lion, so no bone of Joseph's prophet is broken. As the old man craved the body of the prophet, so too Joseph craved the body of the prophet. As the old prophet cared for the body of the prophet, so too Joseph cared for the body of the prophet. The idea of Joseph craving the prophet's body, caring for that dead body, and then placing that body into his own tomb, grave, or sepulcher comes from the story of the old prophet and the prophet from Judah. But where does the idea of Joseph craving the body of the prophet come from? We see where the story of that body's placement comes from. This is the structure here of what I'm saying. Where does the idea of the craving of the body come from? Not the placement. Where does the idea of craving, of desiring the body, where does that come from? We see where the placement is there. The placement of the body in the new tomb, that comes from that Old Testament reference. That's plagiarized. But where does the craving of the body come from? Where? We have a record in history from Josephus, and this history, this piece of history, it relates the response of Agrippa I to the death of his best friend Caligula. Let's read. Now this Agrippa, with relation to Caius, did what became one that had been so much honored by him, for he embraced Caius's body after he was dead, and laid it upon a bed, and covered it as well as he could, and went out to the guards, and told them he was still alive. What? He said that they should call for physicians since he was very ill of his wounds. But when he learned that Claudius was carried away violently by the soldiers, he rushed through the crowd to him, and when he found that he was in disorder and ready to resign up the government to the Senate, Agrippa encouraged him to take his position. Here we have the story of Joseph and Jesus as relayed through Agrippa and Caligula. The body was still alive, said Agrippa I. The body was still alive, even though it was reported that he was dead. Even though it was reported that he was dead. As Josephus articulates before this point, it was reported that he was dead. But Agrippa I took the body, as it says, as became one that was much honored, as one a friend would do for another, because they are best friends. literally. Cared for that body, desired it and craved for it, and it was not dead despite the reports that it was dead. This idea of Joseph caring and craving for the body of Jesus comes from this piece of history concerning Agrippa I and Caligula, Caius. That Joseph in the story, that Joseph is actually Agrippa I. Actually Agrippa I. It is Agrippa I that is craving for the body. The authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark begins the trend of all of this. They have taken history and they have re-articulated history. They've taken history, they have re-articulated history. Their main character from beginning to end is Herod Agrippa I. This is evident. And yet they are taking bits and pieces from Genesis to Malachi to further construct their narrative to make it appear legitimate. We have to know this. The idea of one craving the body of the prophet comes from the scene involving Caligula's assassination. The Joseph embracing the prophet is in reality Agrippa I. As Agrippa I craved or embraced the body of the supposedly slain because Caligula only looked dead, but apparently he was not yet. So too Joseph absolutely did the same. Joseph in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He craved or embraced the body of the supposedly slain. Now this Agrippa, with relation to Caius, embraced Caius's body after he was dead, laid it upon a bed, covered it as well as he could, went out to the guards, told them that Caius was still alive. But he said that they should call for physicians, since he was very ill of his wounds. Previous to this, there's no intimation that the man was alive at all. He was killed and killed dead, but here we have a whole different kind of perspective going on that's just completely random. He's not dead. He's still alive, even though the reports are, and even though by all means we are, it's set in that narrative of Josephus, he is dead. Here we have this sliver of history, this sliver of rumored history, that he wasn't actually as dead as the author made it appear. He was still alive, actually. And Agrippa I wanted them to call physicians for him. The authors of the Gospels, Mark actually begins all of this. They've blatantly taken records from former kings of Israel and from the assassination of Caligula to again masterfully weave Agrippa I into the narrative. We have to remember that Joseph is identified by Mark as Agrippa I. In the previous presentation on this, from Marcus Julius Agrippa I of the book of Mark, the author of Mark specifically takes a very crucial piece of Joseph's history and places it into their narrative. They do this because their narrative is about a Joseph. Who is a Joseph? A Joseph is one that is sentenced to prison, ultimately wrongly, raised up out of prison, and then eventually set beside the king of the universal empire, possessing a throne of his own over the people and especially of his own blood. Joseph as a title is assigned to Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I is assigned the title of Joseph. So when we're seeing Joseph caring and craving for the body of the main character, we're actually seeing Herod Agrippa I caring and embracing the body of the main character. And we can say that because history allows us to, or at least rumored history allows us to. The record of Josephus explaining the care that Agrippa took toward the body of his friend is the same sort of craving and care that Joseph of Arimathea takes towards the main character. That same Joseph after craving and caring for that body, places him in his own tomb, which is a plagiarized account from the book of Kings. Nothing within Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is real because it's not supposed to be. This is not supposed to be real. This is an act. This is an act. These are actors, and the main character is assigned multiple roles within this play because it's all about Mark. It is the gospel of Marcus. It is the good news of Marcus. But Marcus, except Marcus, has a new name. And as we go on with this presentation, we're going to see how that works according to the Hellenistic ruler system. How/where does the author of Mark assign the title of Joseph to Agrippa I? Mark 14, 51, and 52. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled forth from them naked. We saw in our previous presentation that this was actually taken from Genesis 39, 10 to 12. It came to pass, you spoke to Joseph day by day. He hearkened not. Lie with me. He refused to lie with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. She caught him. She said, lie with me. He left his garment in her hand, fled, got him out. By plagiarizing this scene from Joseph's life, placing it upon their young man, the author of Mark is signifying that the general or underlying main character of their narrative, who is to remain secret, is Joseph. And yet it's really not a secret because their book is named after the main character. The author of Mark is very precise. They're very precise in what they're doing. They're not ignorant. Nothing we're reading is ignorant. There is nothing ignorant within Mark, but as time goes on, of course, the ignorance increases because the superstition surrounded by the main character increases. So the authors writing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're not ultimately ignorant to what they're doing or to what's going on. They know what they're doing, and they know who their narrative is about. Only difference is that in 2024, we now may not know. And it's not as if we're not supposed to, because they give blatant clues. Murderers and killers is like a fact, or there's like some data that they always like to go back to the scene of their own crimes. Well, when we're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they always leave traces of their criminal activities. And their criminal activities, it's literary. And their literary markers, their literary traces, they do and they place, and they do not make it that difficult to understand that what we are reading, it's really not simply fiction. It's actually history, but it's historical fiction. And it's historical fiction dedicated to their deified, quote-unquote, Messiah, to their deified, quote-unquote, king. Again, we're going to see how this type of deification works as we go forward. Linking their young man to Joseph by this one scene, the author of Mark connects that young man to the general scheme revolving around Joseph's immediate situation from within that scene he is in. That Joseph scene in which he fled and left his garment behind is a scene where he is next placed into prison, eventually brought out of prison, and inevitably set beside the king of the universal empire as being second to the king. Copying this Joseph scene and word for word and placing it into their narrative, the author of Mark wants the reader to know that this young man is someone who, to the author's immediate conscience, has been placed into prison, is eventually brought out of prison, and is inevitably set beside the king of the universal empire as being second to the king. Marcus Julius Agrippa I fulfills the vision completely. This one scene identifying Agrippa I with Joseph, it transforms him into quote-unquote Joseph. The title is his. This is why Joseph is craving the body. In reality, it is Agrippa I, quote-unquote Joseph, craving the body of his beloved friend, as it is written in rumored history. There is no Joseph in the book of Mark other than this Joseph. Say that again. There's no Joseph within the book of Mark other than this Joseph. And there's no other Joseph in the book of Mark other than this Joseph, because this Joseph plays the role of Agrippa I in history, or in rumored history. We have to know, and the author allows us to know, that this Joseph is Marcus Agrippa I, because they do know the history and they do know the rumored history, but they have also assigned the title of Joseph to him through their young man. Marcus Agrippa I fulfills the vision of Joseph. The title sticks with him throughout. And as you move on from Mark, and then you get into the Matthews and then into the Luke's, the character evolves. The main character that Joseph represents never changes, but the role of the fictional character Joseph does, because the authors are trying to convey a point of origin. Agrippa I is assigned different roles in the book of Mark. His leading role is Jesus. His supporting role is Joseph. Agrippa I is the Joseph that craved the body. Rumored history confirms this, as we read. Agrippa I owns the title, quote-unquote, Joseph, to the author of the book of Mark. Them plagiarizing the scene of Josephus confirms this, with the author allowing us to know that Agrippa I is quote-unquote Joseph. One must wonder if he is also to be thought of as that Joseph who is the supposed father of Jesus. And now we're taking off. John 6:42. And they said, Is not this Jesus? Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he saith, I came down from heaven? Luke 3:23. And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. If Agrippa I is Joseph, and if Joseph is the supposed father of Jesus, does it then mean that Agrippa I is the father of Jesus? Could it be true that Jesus is simply the product of Agrippa I? So what could this mean? Because the author of the book of Mark has already established the trend by assigning to Joseph the history of Agrippa I and Caligula, that Joseph, as a title, as a name, as an alias, as an alter ego, has been given to Agrippa I. Agrippa I is Joseph of Arimathea. That's Agrippa I. They're taking, again, rumored history, and they're giving to rumored history a character. Not only so, prior to assigning rumored history, Agrippa I and Caligula, the scene of Joseph and the main character, the author of Mark, assigns to Agrippa I the history of what's going on in that young man's life. The scene placed within that young man of Joseph, it's not there by accident. The author of Mark is highlighting who their narrative is actually intended to be about. Their narrative is actually intended to be about, quote unquote, Joseph. And so you have Joseph in that marker there from the young man, and then you have Joseph there in that marker of the scene between Arimathea and the main character, which scene between that Arimathea and the main character, that Joseph of Arimathea and the main character, which scene is taken from the scene of Agrippa I and Caligula. We're supposed to know the trend. We're supposed to know the trend. We're supposed to know the associated trend of character that the authors are implementing and the system that they're using. We're supposed to pick that up. Now, the authors of the Acts, through Saul, moving forward, through Saul, subtly tell the history of the invented deity. Saul as a character, Saul as a character is made up of three components. The first component is a name, the second component is a revelation, the third component is an ethnicity. Dealing with the ethnicity, the name Saul traces back to an Edomite. Genesis 36:1 reads, "Now these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom." Genesis 36:37, same chapter, verse 37, "And Samlah died, and Saul of Rehoboth by the river reigned in his stead." The author of the Acts has selected the name or a name, quote unquote Saul, for a reason. One of the reasons is that this name traces back to an Edomite. And not just any Edomite. When you go back to Genesis 36 and you read, these are the dukes of Esau, the dukes of Edom. These are a duke, royal lineage. So what we have here is the author of the Acts specifically selecting a name that traces back to a royal lineage of Edomites. Want to keep that in mind because that's important. Why would the author do that? Why would the author do that? Why would the author choose the name Saul? There's a plethora of names, and just because the name is changed to Paul means nothing. The Hebrew/Jewish name for Paul is Saul. Saul. The Latin name for Saul. The Latin name for Saul is Paul. They're the same. The only difference is the culture. So why is the author specifically choosing this name for their character? It has everything to do with three components, one of which we're seeing, the ethnicity. Name, revelation, ethnicity. The name Saul traces back to an Edomite of royal lineage. That's important. The name Saul traces back also to a king of Israel. 1 Samuel 15:1 reads, "Samuel also said unto Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord." The name Saul traces back to a revelation received by another king. 2 Kings 16:10 and 11, "And Ahaz went to Damascus to meet the king of Assyria, saw an altar at Damascus." Where was Saul's vision at? "And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest the fashion of the altar and the pattern of it according to all the workmanship thereof. And Uriah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it against King Ahaz came from Damascus." The author of the Acts does not use the name Saul by accident. Saul traces back to an ethnicity of a royal lineage of Esau, who is Edom, who are the Edomites. Saul traces back to the king of Israel. Saul traces back the events that took place to him in the Acts that the author places in there to a vision occurring at Damascus. Saul is a character that is created from three other characters. One character is an Edomite. Two characters are kings over God's people. One of those kings has a revelation in Damascus, the key location concerning Saul's revelation, and the other king is called Saul. The author of the book of Acts wants their reader to know something really important, and something really important that they should not neglect. They have concealed that importance within a character that they have called Saul. The one that saw Jesus, that quote unquote saw Jesus in the book of Acts, is one, an Edomite by blood. Two, a king over God's people. Three, a king over God's people who engineered a mystery religion passed down to his mind from Damascus. The author of the Acts knows that quote-unquote Jesus was engineered by an Edomite king of the Jews. No other individual fits this vision, and especially to the conscience of the author of the book of Acts, other than Agrippa I. These are the little details. These are the little details that really need to be taken into consideration. There's no mistakes. There are no mistakes in these narratives concerning structure. They're fine-tuned according to the ways that the authors want them read, not according to the ways in which 2024 popular theology wants them, or 1930 popular theology wants them, or 1815 popular theology wants them, or 1743 popular theology wants them. The authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have a specific code of reference and a specific agenda, including the Acts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and including the Acts. The authors have a specific agenda for a specific mind, for a specific group. And the mind and the group that that agenda is for, they know who this literature is about. Saul is a key name because it traces back to a royal lineage of Edomites, traces back to a king of Israel, traces back to a king of Judah who received a vision of a mystery religion at Damascus. We can't ignore this. We can't ignore all of these intangibles that the author of Acts fits into their one character, whom they mysteriously called Saul. So how can Agrippa I fit into this? Who is Saul, not Paul, most like in character and in behavior? Acts 22 and verse 3. This is the confession of Paul, supposedly. I'm a man that's born in Tarsus, brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as you all are at this day. Now, what is this character of Gamaliel that this Paul supposedly says he was brought up and trained by? Acts 5:34-39. Then stood there up one in the council of Pharisee named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, had in reputation among all the people, commanded to put the apostles forth a little space, said unto them, You men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do is touching these men. I say unto you, refrain from these men, and let them alone. For if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught. But if it be of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest it haply be found, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God. Now, the character Gamaliel, he's a balanced individual, he's a passive individual, he's a rational individual, he's a patient individual, he's a merciful individual, he's willing to let the deity work instead of himself. Does this sound like Saul at all? Does it sound like Saul? Does it even sound like, when you think back to the works of the character Paul, does it actually sound like Paul? What is Saul's character? Acts 8 verse 3, As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. Now, if Saul does not mirror the individual he supposedly claims trained him or brought him up from a youth, then who did Saul mirror? Acts 12:1-3 says, Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. He killed James the brother of John with the sword, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Saul actually mirrors, and this is supposed to be, Herod Agrippa I in demeanor, behavior, disposition, and in agenda. Why? Why does the author of the Acts write that Gamaliel trained Saul from a youth whose intellect or character he does not share, yet scripts Saul's character according to the nature of Agrippa I? Why does the author do that? Why does the author of the Acts blatantly cause misconception within their narrative? The Saul character is not the Gamaliel character. Even the Paul character, the Latin version of Saul, is not Gamaliel in nature. Why does the author of the book of Acts feel it necessary to say that Gamaliel trained this individual, yet have their character synonymous with the character of Herod Agrippa I? Why is that necessary to the author? Why does that make sense? In what way to the narrative does that suit the author and the type of perspective that they want to give out from there and the type of agenda that they're putting forth through their literature. Why is that important to the author that both Agrippa I and Saul match in every single way? Herod Agrippa I, while by blood a Jew, is an Edomite, and he is also God's king and anointed. Both Agrippa I and Saul share the same demeanor, behavior, disposition, and agenda. The author of the Acts calls Saul, quote unquote, Saul, because the name traces back to a Saul who is of royal Edomite lineage. The author of the Acts has their Saul's revelation on the way to Damascus because God's king had his revelation from Damascus. Having a Damascus revelation directly points to the king that had a Damascus revelation. The scene is plagiarized. The author of the Acts has their Saul called quote-unquote Saul because the name traces back to Israel's king. The author of the book of Acts is assigning Agrippa I a supporting role, which role is the role of Saul. This supporting role is altogether literal, philosophical, and figurative. And that's really important to the narrative, especially as we move forward and we see how titles and roles are assigned to Hellenistic kings, which culture the Roman imperial cult mimicked. Now, the author of the book of the Acts, taking all of their machinations into consideration, they know that Jesus is the product of an Edomite king of Israel. This is why the author calls Saul, Saul. Jesus, or a mystery religion centered around a dying and rising Jewish Hellenized deity, is the invention of an Edomite king of the Jews who is also a member of a tribe of Israel. Saul, the royal Edomite, plus Ahaz, king of Jerusalem, who had the Damascus revelation, plus Saul, the king of Israel of the tribe of Benjamin, equals a king of Israel who is both Jew and Gentile. Agrippa I fulfills the vision. The author of the Acts has placed Agrippa I into Saul to admit a story of origin for a Jesus movement. That's why the two in behavior and character are the same, because they're actually the same person. They're the same person from a different angle. To the author of the book of Acts, to the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each and every single one of their characters, within each and every single one of their chapters, they play roles of scenes. Roles of scenes. In these roles of scenes, angles matter. When you're looking at the history of what Saul represents, made up of components, the name Saul tracing back to an Edomite king, to royal Edomite lineage, the name Saul tracing back to an Israelite king, and Saul, from the book of Acts, having his vision on the way to Damascus, represents another king of the deity of the Jews, having a revelation in Damascus. The name Saul and the components that the author of the book of Acts places in there to pronounce and to enunciate this Saul's relevance, they all trace back to a specific angle, to a king of Israel, to the conscience of the author of the book of Acts, to a king of Israel who is both Jew and Gentile. There's really no one else to the conscience of the book of the Acts that fulfills the vision other than Agrippa I. And when we're seeing Saul, we're seeing the placement of a role of assignment. There's a little bit more to that because the name Saul, although having 3 source components, there's another component. So those 3 source components, an Edomite of royal nobility, king of Israel, king of Jerusalem / Judah, who received the Damascus vision. The Saul of the Acts is in reality an Edomite king of Israel from a tribe of Israel. Yet another component for which is assigned to that Saul is Balaam, because the happenings of that Saul also are the happenings of that Balaam. They're picking and choosing which happenings are supposed to go to their Saul character. And in Numbers 22, 31 and 32. The Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, his sword drawn in his hand. He bowed down his head, fell flat on his face, and the angel of the Lord said unto him, Wherefore hast thou smitten thine ass these 3 times? Behold, I went out to withstand thee, because thy way is perverse before me. Acts 9, 3-5. As he journeyed, he came near to Damascus. Suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. He fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? He said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said to him, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Saul's scene contextually mirrors Balaam's scene. On his way to curse the supposed host of God, after having his eyes opened, he sees the revelation of a figure. He drops to the earth, at which point that figure chastises him. Again, this is another plagiarized scene. And it is a plagiarized scene, just as all of the other ones, for a specific reason. Why all this plagiarism, though? Why not just be original? I mean, as a writer myself, this is killing me. Plagiarism suggests an agenda serving a point that is known only to the authors. The plagiarism of the author of the Acts and their blatant rehearsal of characters and scenes suggests that they know the quote-unquote Jesus, which is or can be thought of as a mystery religion that would become embodied by Jesus, was created by an Edomite king of the Jews from one of the tribes of Israel. They link Saul and Agrippa I together to confess a literary connection between them. The character Saul is, in some way, shape, or form, an alter ego of Agrippa I. It is Agrippa I that has created or that has fathered Jesus. The link to Balaam, who is a false prophet, suggests from the author of the book of Acts, from the perspective of the author of the book of Acts, that this religion created by Saul is false or fraudulent. There's a lot that goes into these names. The idea of linking Saul to Agrippa I is an idea of altered ego. The idea of altered ego. This is an extension of this one character, but in another dimension. And in this other dimension, the author allows us to know who they're talking about because they give that other dimension name a name specific to the one for which that extension traces back to. They call that extension Saul. Again, Saul traces back to an Edomite royal lineage. Saul traces back to a king of Israel. So what we have in the name Saul is an Edomite king of Israel. This Saul, who traces back to an Edomite of royal lineage and to a king of Israel, also has in the book of Acts his vision occurring in the same sort of location as the King Ahaz. The vision of King Ahaz, the revelation and the event of King Ahaz is taken and given to that Saul. What we now have is Saul in the book of Acts, who is supposed to be understood as an Edomite of royal lineage, who is also, while being at the same time an Edomite of royal lineage, a king of Israel. This Edomite of royal lineage, who is a king of Israel, is having a vision of a mystery religion for which he will set up in the land of Jerusalem, because that's what Ahaz did. Vision from Damascus, king of Jerusalem. King of Jerusalem took his vision from Damascus and set up a mystery religion in Jerusalem. Author of the book of Acts is giving us encoded language to let us know that a mystery religion was set up in Jerusalem by an Edomite of royal lineage who is a king of Israel. There is no one in history that fits this than Herod Agrippa I. There is no one in history, there's no one in history according to the conscience of the author writing the book of the Acts that fits this other than Marcus Julius Agrippa the First. And then inside of that, they have also placed scenes and events familiar to the Balaam scene and event to let us know that what this Edomite of royal lineage, who is also a king of Israel, whose vision is received and placed of a mystery religion in Jerusalem, their concoction is fraudulent and false. So not only are, and specifically in reference to the perception of the author writing the book of Acts, not only are they seeing this Edomite of royal lineage, that is the king of Israel, who is also setting up his mystery religion, the vision of his mystery religion in Jerusalem, they're not only seeing that, they're also letting the reader know, their audience know, that what's happening by this Edomite of royal lineage, that is the king of Israel, whose mystery religion and its vision is set up amongst the people of the Jews, it's false. They're letting their audience know that it's false and it's fraudulent. Now, the author of the book of Mark understands who Joseph is. The author of Mark gives to Joseph, who is their only Joseph, the rumored historical behavior of Agrippa I. The authors of the Gospels concerning Joseph, they understood what Mark understood, that Joseph is a character consistently representing Marcus Julius Agrippa I. They understand, just as the author of the Acts does, that an Edomite king of Israel, who also has his lineage from one of the tribes of Israel, quote unquote, fathered, quote unquote, Jesus. This king who plays Joseph is ultimately identified as Agrippa I. In reality, Agrippa I as Joseph gives birth to himself as Jesus. The author of Mark and of Luke, the gospel writers as a whole, as an entirety, allow us to understand that they held Agrippa I as fulfilling the role of Jesus. Mark specifically begins this trend. The rumored secret that they all know is that the Jesus character may not simply be based on Agrippa I, but quote unquote Agrippa I may have conceived of the Jesus character himself. This is why Jesus is the supposed son of Joseph. Both Jesus and Joseph are fiction characters, and no fiction character is real. Yet every fiction character has a parent. The supposed father of Jesus, the supposed father of the Jesus character is Joseph, who is quote unquote Agrippa I, because the actual source or father is Agrippa I. And it's completely fascinating and beyond fascinating. And as a writer myself, when I think back to the novel I wrote, Azazel, The Search for Life After Death, the way that you construct a narrative, you don't just, it's not as fiction as it may be. I'm always saying that there is more reality in fiction than in reality, and I'm always saying that when it comes to fiction, you don't get away from reality through fiction, you actually plunge into reality from fiction. So it's really interesting looking at how the makeup of the Jesus character is, and looking at all of the literary elements that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John place into their narratives, and to see that Mark actually begins this cycle and trend, to see how all of this is, the different roles assigned to different characters, and the different characters tracing back to a figure, and the figure given, again, different character roles and placements. It's really, really interesting. And where Mark left off, Matthew and the Matthews of the world, the Lukes of the world, they picked it up. They revamped the TV show, they revamped the movie, and they added new elements to it without getting away from the core elements and structure from which they took their narrative and their scenes from. It's really interesting. Now, transitioning to the idea of how kings become gods is what we want to focus on here. The idea of the transition from king to God. Now, the first king to be God was a king of the king of the Akkads. Naram, son of Akkad, was the first one in Mesopotamian history to become a god. Neither the length nor the exact dates of his reign are certain. As mentioned above, the old Akkadian state is the first territorial state in Mesopotamian history. The kings of Akkad, a city that has not been located yet, succeeded, albeit briefly, in conquering large parts of Mesopotamia and including it in their empire. Naram Sin was the grandson of Sargon, the founder of the old Akkadian dynasty. Naram Sin's reign, during which he faced several rebellions against his centralized rule, initiated the beginning of the end of the old Akkadian state, and in the native Mesopotamian cultural memory, he acquired a reputation of being an unsuccessful king, though it is unlikely that this was related to his deification being perceived as sacrilegious. The exact circumstances that led up to his deification are unknown. There are no details regarding the existence of a royal cult for this king, at least not from the old Akkadian period itself. Almost everything that we know about the worship of statues of old Akkadian kings comes from later periods, 300 to 500 years after the old Akkadian dynasty. The main source of our information is the statue inscription written in the king's name that tells us that the people of the city of Akkad petitioned the gods to make Naram Sin a god and then proceeded to build him a temple for him in Akkad. Yet there are no other sources that could confirm Naram Sin's claim or offer details. So this, as we go forward now, looking at this culture of how kings become gods is important because it's not actually the king that deifies himself. Even though it is the king that deifies himself, it's more along the lines of a specific assembly, a specific people that deify the king themselves. When you get into the Roman history, these Roman rulers, the emperors, they are alive when it is told them that they are worshipped as gods, and yet they don't want to admit to that while they're alive, yet they still know that around the universal empire there are little cults of theirs, little churches that have them as deities that they are being worshipped as. And then after their death, as is here, now their cult becomes something public, or something happens to where it becomes political, and then all of a sudden there's like an extreme branch of it, and it becomes popular, and now it's sweeping across the empire, and they are worshipped as gods in their specific cults, and it's become known not just in their reign, their territory, reign of Rome, it's known now across the world. Now, worshipping a ruler was not something invented by the Romans. Rather, these types of cults were a common phenomenon among nations of the world. The Roman imperial cult quickly grew outside of Rome itself, since it was an outlet for displays of loyalty to or acclamation of the current ruler of Rome or the favored dynasty. Octavian was worshipped as Augustus. Now, that's important because the name transition is what I want to focus on here. The name transition. The name transition. Marcus Julius Agrippa I transitions as Jesus. Want to pay attention to how these names are formed, how kings are deified, and the transition that's here. Octavian transitioned to Augustus. Octavian was worshipped as Augustus by groups from various cities as an appeal for patronage and to cement alliances. The imperial cult was not strictly about magnifying the emperor as ruler, rather it was about magnifying the emperor as one who stands for Rome and the empire. Octavian, rather than having the cult focus solely on himself, allowed the various groups he conquered to build altars to Roma at Augustus. Now, that's important. You're not building a temple to Octavian. I am Octavian. You're not building a temple to me. You're building a temple to the deified version of me who is called Augustus. So who is Roma? Altars to Roma at Augustus, signifying that the ruler was identified directly with the city and empire. The point is that the Roman imperial cult was used as a political tool to bring other people into the empire. For this reason, the cult spread through outlying provinces without having a firm foothold in Rome itself. The imperial cult originally deified Rome as the goddess Roma. There you go. Who's Rome? Rome was deified as the goddess Roma. So when you're setting up altars to Roma et Augustus, you're setting up altars to Rome as a deity and to Octavian as a deity. In reality, they're not called this. Their names are changed. Rome becomes Roma. Octavian becomes Augustus. The culture of the names and of these people, they become changed, and of their empires when they are now transitioning away from this earth realm to the realm of the gods. The imperial cult originally deified Rome as the goddess Roma and the emperor to the conquered or allied nations by presenting them with altars of Roma and Augustus. The first person to be deified by the city of Rome, a practice typically performed by a decree from the Senate, as in this case, was Julius Caesar. A debate surrounds the timing of this event, especially since the enactment by Rome did not necessarily follow upon the formal ratification of divine honors. In addition, with the making and breaking of alliances by Antony and Octavian, the Senate was unable to carry out much in the way of their own official proclamations. Julius claimed divinity for himself through Aeneas of Troy. This is the mythological figure who alleged his own divine status by descent from Venus. The Senate offered Caesar multiple honors for his various victories. Julius already held the position of Pontifex Maximus, a position that placed one man between the nations and the gods. Through these honors, the Senate granted Julius divinity, possibly even during his own lifetime. People who owed Caesar either favors or money, any sort of debt, made inscriptions calling him a god. Sacrifices were made on Caesar's birthday during his lifetime, an act made official in 42 BC. An inscription on a statue in the city of Rome labeled him as having divine status, as did many other inscriptions. Again, just want to point out how this is working, how we are seeing a supposed king associating himself and accepting the name or the title of another deity or of a deity, either invented or already known. Octavian officially deified Julius Caesar after his death and after his murderers were killed. During his lifetime, Julius turned down the title king while never once turning down the title of God. This continued the idea of a ruler cult in European politics. This continued the idea of a ruler cult in European politics, obviously something that could not be instituted during the Republic era. A desire of rulers for more political control patterned after Alexander the Great. Typically, the pattern began with the person who would become a ruler earning great military victories. Hence, Domitian striving to earn the name Germanicus, the country prospering, and the emperor dying with witnesses to his spirit ascending to heaven. Does that sound familiar? Read that again. The emperor dying with witnesses to his spirit ascending to heaven. The pattern of the deification of the ruler began with divine status in the provinces and conquered nations during the life of the ruler, and then in Rome after death. Continued during the life of the rules of Nero and Domitian. While there is less direct evidence for Nero and Domitian, Domitian demanded divine honorifics when holding court. Juventus Celestis and others named him. That's just the name there. That's crazy. They called him this. This was supposed to be his divine name per his instruction. Martial also compared Domitian to Janus and Jupiter, and he described him as Heracles. This last comparison likely is tied to the statue of Heracles, Domitian's face, bearing Domitian's face. So this transition and the idea of receiving a new name, your image and likeness placed onto a statue, all of a sudden the statue was something and now it's not because it's supposed to bear your face now. The idea of the ascension from being a king, a mortal king, to a divinity among the gods. this transfer of the cult of empires, the cult of rulers, the cult of kings, it's really nothing new. And when we're going through and seeing how the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the Acts line up, specifically Marcus Julius Agrippa I as quote unquote Jesus, we have to be able to understand the culture and the times of which these things are written in. And this allows us actually to know who the authors are. These are not random people. These are not whoever we want to imagine them. These are elites that are writing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if they're not writing them by, if the elites are not writing them, they are written by scribes of elites with the agenda of them in there. And we can see this clearly through their portrait and portrayal of the characters that they are placing into their narratives. Thompson gives evidence against himself, noting that the crowds and lower officials used the language of Dominus et Deus, and that Marshall later had to disavow his use of the same terms for Domitian. Now, Titus minted coins that utilized the title Divf, Divine Flavian, or possibly Filius, for his brothers as successors to the throne. In addition, it is clear that Trajan was also called Dominus, translated by Dio Chrysostom as Curie Odge. So that's the divine, supposedly the divine name of Trajan, Dominus, and then Curie Odge. One should also note that there was a mixture of divine titles used for the emperors throughout the Roman world, with such names as God, Son of God, God made manifest, Lord, Lord of the whole world, Lord's Day, Savior of the world, Epiphany, Imperator. So all of these titles were assigned to the kings now become deities, while alive and then after. Clearly, the titles of divinity were used for the emperors, not just in the provincial areas of the empire, but even in Rome itself. Even though Claudius rejected divine accolades everywhere, a temple was erected in his honor in Britain. Vespasian, the ruler after Nero, also refused divine honors during his life. However, upon his deathbed, he said, I am becoming a god. Titus, successor to his father Vespasian, consecrated both his father and his sister Domitilla, building a temple for the former in Rome. Trajan, the last emperor during the 1st century, deified Domitian. He also verbally rejected divine honors, yet he had a temple built for himself. He was considered to be an aspect of Jupiter by the people. With respect to the persecution of Christians under Pliny the Younger, he used the litmus test of offering incense, wine, and worship to the image of Trajan, a practice which Trajan endorsed. Same similar worship is still going on today, except the name is different. These emperors, the so-called sane ones, when compared to Nero, Gaius, Caligula, and Domitian, offered lip service to denying deification during their lives, but they let statues be built in their image, offerings of incense and wine be given, temples be erected in foreign locals, and various titles to appear in public, all of which point toward an informal form of deification. At the very least, the people offer them worship as gods, even if they in life deny the honors themselves. While no formal evidence for deification of these emperors occurs within Rome during their lives, those who lived within the Roman Empire outside of the city hailed these rulers as gods, and therefore those in Rome knew of the divine status afforded them. That's the culture. That's where we are when we're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Acts. That's where we are. We have to be able to be mindful of where we are. We have to be able to be mindful of where we are when we're going through these things, and especially when we're seeing the authors themselves specifically line up literary patterns of their own age and of their own time as signs fixed for the trend of their literature. We have to be mindful. Agrippa I was a grandson of Herod the Great. What is the background of Agrippa I? His father was Aristobulus, the son of Herod and the Asmonean Marianne. His mother was Berenice, the daughter of Herod's sister Salome and the Idumean Costobarus. Thus, Agrippa was 1/4 Jew, 3/4 Idumean. Idumean is Edomite. The Idumeans are the Edomites. He was born about 10 BC, orphaned due to the execution of his father by his grandfather, who was then sent to live in Rome. When hardly 6 years old, Agrippa was sent to Rome to acquire a good education. He was brought up in the imperial court. As a little child, his best friend was Drusus, the son of the Emperor Tiberius, while his ambitious mother contracted valuable friendships which were to actually help him later on in life, and did. Agrippa also tried to advance his standing by many gifts to Romans and by a luxurious life, and this extravagance showed itself especially after death had removed the restraining influence of his mother. So let's just pay attention to the name of his mother. His father was Aristobulus, the son of Herod and the Asmonean Marianne. His mother was Berenice. His grandmother. His grandmother's name was Mary. Marianne? Mary. Cut that short. All of the traces are just in the story put together for us. The power to offer protection is an essential feature of the king's mortal divinity. So having just read about the life of Agrippa I, he is brought up in the Roman court. He is brought up in the imperial Roman court, brought up in their culture, friends and best friends to the emperor. He has within his blood the mindset of what it means to be a Roman emperor. The power to offer protection is an essential feature of the king's mortal divinity. This explains why in the earliest phases of Hellenistic royal cult, it was not the ruler himself who declared his divinity, but usually the real or potential recipient of his benefactions. Since Hellenistic kings, or at least most of them, resembled the immortal gods in the care they took for humans, they deserved to receive similar expressions of gratitude as the gods. The Greek phrase, which is often used to describe the establishment of divine honors, expresses no more and no less than this. The king is to receive isthio temai, or honors equal to those bestowed upon the gods. Rather than equating the kings to the gods, with this phrase, the grateful community asserts in a subtle way that the king is not a god, even though he received the same honors from the thankful community. The attribute theos was usually given to a king or a queen only posthumously. The culture can only say that so much. The Herodians were a Hellenistic group. They were Hellenistic Jews. The culture of Hellenistic empires, rulers, and kings is the deification of the emperor, ruler, or king. And not just deification of, okay, this is them as a mortal king. They're going to continue the same as a mortal king, as an immortal god. It's a little bit different because their entire sphere changes. They get a new name, they get a new dress, they get a new makeup, they get worship and service that is supposed to be diverse, yet still having familiar elements to what is known. It's a culture. Alexander introduced, however, an additional element in his divinity with the claim that he was the son of Zeus. The date and the circumstances in which this claim was made are a matter of controversy, but it should be noted that such a claim was not unknown in Greek history. As late as the 5th century, the famous Thasian athlete Theagnes was believed to be the son of Heracles, and his colleague Euthymus of Locroi was regarded as the son of the river god Caekinos. Alexander's claim to a direct descent from a god found at least one follower among his successors. A hymn discovered regards Seleucus I as the son of Apollo. In most respects, the cult of Alexander continued and strengthened the existing traditions. So aside from the point of the king being God, we also have to keep in mind, as has been said by these authors that I'm citing, that the point of the imperial cult, of the point of the king as God, it is to reinforce the political tradition and also the political religious tradition of the throne. It is a tool and an instrument used to enforce the religious and the religious political agenda of the throne, to maintain traditions in both the secular side and the sectarian side, to bridge both together so that no one really knows that they're actually honoring still men, and that they're actually following the agenda of humans. The Hellenistic kings were often worshipped as temple-sharing gods through the erection of their statue in the temple of other deities. In Hellenistic Egypt, not the living kings, but only the deceased ones seem to have received a cult as Sinai in the temples of other deities. In general, Hellenistic cities preferred to honor a king by establishing a separate shrine for him, naturally in the city's most prominent place. Sometimes the sanctuaries of rulers were the places where public documents are inscribed. It seems quite natural that in Arsino, in Cilicia, public documents were inscribed in the sanctuary of the queen to whom the city owed its name. Again, just want to continue that trend of how these kings operated. And this trend of operation we're going to see is a trend that began in Egypt. Of course, it began with Alexander the Great, but the kings thereof continued the trend, and officially, quote unquote, officially, this trend of becoming a god after death was ascribed to kings not while they were living, supposedly, but while they were dead. And I have here underlined also that the sanctuaries of these individuals, of which their documents were placed, they were inscribed publicly. Public documents of who knows what they might have been, the stories that might have been told of the transition of that king from being a mortal to an immortal. They were public documents, the same way that we have the public documents of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark beginning that trend. Late Ptolemaic Egypt played a very important part in the transmission of the ruler cult to Rome. It is probable that Caesar received divine honors in Alexandria, and it is certain that Mark Antony was assimilated with Dionysos and Heracles. The Caesarion in Alexandria, whether first dedicated to Divius Julius, Mark Antony, or Octavian, presents an early example of a shrine for a Roman general. It's not surprising that in the Greek East, the cult of Octavian and Augustus was modeled after Hellenistic traditions. Pointing that out, because when it comes to the divinity of Hellenistic rulers, that's key. In the previous presentation, citing that scene where Marcus Julius Agrippa I, after receiving the title of king from Caligula, ventured from Rome to collect his empire in the land of the Jews. Before collecting his empire in the land of the Jews, he stopped in Alexandria. What happened in Alexandria? In Alexandria, Philo at that time, along with the Alexandrian Jews, were hailing and celebrating Marcus Julius Agrippa I as the king of the Jews. In Alexandria, there is a history of Marcus Julius Agrippa I and his son Agrippa II. There is a real mysterious history of these two in Alexandria, Egypt. It is also in Egypt where the praises of Marcus Julius Agrippa I as king, where those praises were not welcomed by the Alexandrians. They took an individual named Barabbas in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's called Barabbas. They took a Barabbas, dressed him up in a purple robe, put a false reed in his hand, put a weird crown around his head of another reed. They bowed the knee to him as if they were his counselors taking advice from him, and they falsely worshipped this Barabbas, who is written of as being by Philo a madman, as a king. The idea of a Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Again, Jesus is Marcus Julius Agrippa I. Jesus having this robe around him, this crown on him, this scene of him being mocked by the Roman soldiers. This scene comes from what took place in the life of Marcus Julius Agrippa I with the Alexandrians mocking him. The Jesus of that scene in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is Herod Agrippa I. No, the scene didn't take place in reality, the way that it is written by the author. The actual reality is that it was a scene mocking the then King of the Jews, Marcus Agrippa I, which I showed in the previous presentation. There is a question akin to that of the cult of the sovereigns, the origin of their official surnames. They are almost certainly, some of them obviously, religious and connected with the cult. Now, a point to be observed is that wherever ancient authors attempted to explain any of these names, they represent them not as having been assumed on his own initiative by the sovereign, but as having been conferred by this or that people. The explanations they give may be plainly wrong in some of the individual cases, but their consensus on this one point, that the names are conferred, carries weight. It may well be that the kings wished their cult to have, as far as possible, the appearance of spontaneity, and that they prided themselves on the popular origin of their surnames. This is in reference to Hellenistic rulers and to the culture of Hellenistic rulers that the rulers and the emperors and kings of Rome adopted, which culture is inevitably the same culture that the Herodians adopted, because the Herodians, the Caesars, and the Alexandrian governance, they are all connected, one and the same. Their culture is shared. So when we're seeing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark beginning the trend, Mark specifically highlights their main character as Jesus. Mark's main character, Marcus Julius Agrippa I, as Jesus. Previous presentation, we saw how this individual, this King Herod Agrippa I, received his name, received his title. The authors keep it up. Not only do they keep that up, they assign different roles to this same one king. The Herodians were a sect of Hellenistic Jews, in summary. Agrippa I is a product of Rome. It's not unlikely that the culture of Roman rulers, which transferred to Rome from Hellenistic Egyptian rulers, continued in the Herodian lineage. Agrippa I's legacy is transferred over to the Jesus character. Agrippa I obtains the title of Joseph by the gospel writers, and Mark begins this. Agrippa I, as the fictional character Joseph, fathers the fiction character Jesus. Agrippa I fathers himself. Agrippa I conceives himself through a character. Joseph is actually Agrippa I. We saw the title is fixed to him. Jesus is actually Agrippa I. We've seen this. The previous presentation, the title is fixed to him. The role is fixed. The Joseph of Jesus, it's actually Herod Agrippa I. And early on when I said that, I had that in quotation, that it was Agrippa I, because as we're seeing, it is a following, or it is followers that actually assign to the individual king their surname. While the king's still alive, He understands his surname. He also understands the religion attributed to him. He understands it all. It's supposed to appear as spontaneity upon their death. Yet the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and especially the Acts, the way that the author of the Acts goes about their Saul character, they allow their reader to know that the components making up their Saul character are actually the components that make up Marcus Julius Herod Agrippa I. The Jesus character is a character that is invented, according to the author of the book of Acts, by an Edomite of royal lineage who is also a king of Israel. No other individual to the conscience and to the perspective of the author of the book of Acts fits that other than King Herod Agrippa I. The authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we are highlighting and have been Mark, author of the book of Mark, and now author of the book of Acts, they're letting us know the secret. They're letting us know the secret. And the secret is that the Jesus character is an invention, is a Herodian invention. The Herodian invention to continue the trend of rulers, of Hellenistic rulers. When we go through these things logically and rationally and observe the trends, we can see the mind state of what's going on with these Herodian rulers, their culture. They want to keep up the same culture that's in Rome. They want to keep up the same culture that's in Egypt, because when you go through their lineage, their actual lineage, each and every single one of them, the Roman kings, the Egyptian governors and all of that, and the Herodians, they're all intertwined by marriage and by birth. They're all keeping through to the culture. And it is not a surprise to find in Mark that begins this trend traces of that culture. So talking about the allegorical birth of Jesus, it's a little bit more deeper than we realize, because while this is a fiction character, there's actual history in this, and this actual history traces back, and as we should expect from the time period, to a king, King Herod Marcus Julius Agrippa I.